natural gas industry propaganda. Okay, I'm going to have to accept that I'm going to be making statements that I'm not going to offer proof for. I'm just going to ask you to listen for a few minutes on each component. We're going to start with something really simple. 27 states or more, and an unknown number of cities, counties, or local laws exist requiring certain changes if you use gas for heating, for water heating, and for cooking in a business or in a home or in a new build already. That's not 50 states, that's just about half the population already lives with this sort of thing. Complaining really loudly that the government is coming for your gas stove sounds like propaganda to me. But let's say it's not. Let's go through this. 27 states require carbon monoxide monitors by law under certain conditions. If you run a business where the people are working there and are not presumed to voluntarily want to be involved in a carbon monoxide poisoning incident, or you run a restaurant, no one's signing off on a warning you didn't give them about the carbon monoxide. Get the idea, right? So they require certain things like ventilation, literally a hood vent over the stove if it's using gas, maybe even if it's just doing food. Also, if something catches on fire, it's going to be a carbon monoxide, carbon dioxide, and just a fire hazard. Ventilating it makes it to where you don't die from smoke inhalation. So places that have that happening, like New York City is infamous for any place that's cooking food having a fire. I mean, it's a joke about New York restaurants. They catch on fire once a week. The fire marshal just shows up there on lunch to help put out the fire and then give you the okay that you're not a fire hazard. There's a bunch of jokes about this. You got to understand, this is kind of ingrained in it. Why? Okay, let's move on. Federal law does not have a standard governing air quality and air pollution indoors. There's no EPA for a non-environmental cause. Is there an upper limit in some places? Again, some places have rules about restaurants or businesses that use any kind of heating or stove or whatever for air quality, for minimum benefit of people. Again, an employee technically has signed off on taking a risk, but if you don't inform them of the risk, then you're making your employees consent to something without knowledge of it. It's not consensual. Home cooking spaces are not required to be ventilated in most areas. Privately owned gas stoves, gas heaters in your house, and water heaters aren't necessarily required to be maintained. Now, that last part is very important. Many companies who don't give a shit if you and I die, or our children die, or the cat or dog dies, or the bird you have, parakeets, canaries, they do not want regulation that requires that after you've installed everything perfectly, you do understand that putting in a gas stove or water heater or whatever running on gas, you do have to have them checked once in a while, right? There should be an inspection to make sure the equipment is working correctly. How do we test that? Well, you run it, test the gas quality, the air quality, after 3 minutes of just running the burners. Make sure it doesn't produce anything above a certain limit. You have to then shut everything off and then test to see if it's leaking the fuel gas. By the way, it says natural gas. What type of gas is it? Then you have to look it up, right? The natural gas industry does not like using the name of the gases. That's a problem. So what happens if you maintain it perfectly and you make sure that you're following all the guidelines? Damned government mandates that the equipment be tested every year. What do they produce when they're working perfectly, ideally right after you plug them in? Okay, here we go. Carbon monoxide, nitrogen oxide, nitrogen dioxide, formaldehyde, and many other gases when they're perfect. That's under ideal conditions at 3 times the level that would be tolerated in a city's air quality before they would declare an air quality emergency because people with breathing problems might die from it. And they tell you to go inside because it'll have better air quality. I'm talking about it being 3 times as bad as when there's a fucking forest fire and you're downwind of it. It's 10 times worse in most cases. See also that if the stove or whatever uses a pilot light instead of using a flow detection and an ignition with an electrical signal, it's going to produce burning gas, pollutants continually. And are you maintaining the idea that that pilot light is actually also calibrated correctly? Okay, again, ideal conditions when it's first put in. Now, for those of you who don't know this, I lived in an apartment building that had a natural gas stove with no hood vent. And I also made stoves. I fettled. I made them for alcohol, gasoline, and kerosene. Well, I mostly repaired those. I made mostly just alcohol stoves. I even made charcoal stoves and wood stoves. And I tested them by opening my windows in the room on top of the stove with the ceiling vent on because they didn't give us a good hood vent. And I could make a stove that consistently put out less crap than that gas stove that I was required to use because an electric stove was just verboten. Well, we're not going to let you have an electrical hot plate in your apartment. Really? What about if I legally alter the gas stove not to have the gas range in and just put on an electric range? Or am I allowed to put on electric hot plates over it? I looked up the law. I'm allowed to do that. Well, I don't want that. And then I handed the law to them and said, I'm going to hand this to everybody in the building along with the results I got from the stove. And again, I went ahead and fettled it to get the air quality better, and it was still shit. And I asked them to come in and redo it, make sure it's correct. And he set it to where, okay, that should be good enough. I'm like, okay. And then I brought out the meter. And it was one of these big meters that they use for inspecting places that actually have any regulations at all. I said, do you want me to do this in front of you? Or do you act like you didn't hear it or see it? He's like, I don't want to. Okay. And I showed him, and he's like, I let him borrow it. He went to every room in the building and recalibrated every one of them so nobody would get sick. And that was also including the pilot light that uses a backflow kind of burning thing to ignite things. And again, with the pilot light, it's always worse because it's running constantly. I went ahead and built a piezoelectric snap circuit that I could hook up that used a mechanical impactor, and instead of an electrical one, and used that to ignite my stove. And eventually he came up and just added the correct one to it, and then it ran right. Unless you maintain, ventilate, and ignite correctly, and have it never have the gas available to it by having all the seals work perfectly, and somehow they're supposed to work for 5 years or 1 year even, and or you use lockouts, plunger lockouts, or other things to make it where you can totally shut off the gas. Unless you do this consistently, having a local or federally mandated requirement for it to be done, which is the only reason anybody gets off their ass and does anything. You have to have a fine of $1,000 per incident. Unless you do that, and again, the gas industry, natural gas industry, it's natural, doesn't want that mandated because none of the equipment would pass. So what was being talked about a while ago? New installs cannot use shit quality stoves. That's actually what the wording is. It required that the gas industry, which is supposed to just supply the fuel, it's not supposed to complain about mandating things. They knew it would have an effect on them. It would mandate that all new installs have appropriate igniters, not require that you have a pilot light, work correctly, and very importantly, be able to be tested and recalibrated often enough that it becomes a negligible problem and require a fume hood. And also one of the other ones that was talked about is to legally make it illegal to use the word natural gas for the rest of the time and name the gas's name. So you can look it up on Wikipedia and find out, oh, it's this. If you look up natural gas, you find it on Wikipedia anyway, but why are you avoiding saying which gas it is? Or you can just use induction hot plates or an induction range instead, which takes up a shit ton less space and can be installed by almost anyone in the same space. If you own your house or own the equipment, you can just install an electrical top side thing The one that's for the baking oven, you use it so little, it's probably fine the way it is, but make sure it does not use a pilot light. Put a fume hood in if you don't want to do those, or even if you do, put a fume hood in. It consists of the same amount of effort it takes to put in a drier air pathway and use it to vent the gases so it doesn't cause problems. Again, it's anywhere from 3 to 10 times as bad, on a good day, depending on the setup you have, compared to the point when you would mandate people not go outside because they might get sick. Now let's talk about kids. Childhood asthma cases caused by gas stove, nitrogen dioxide, etc. is 1/8 of the cases of asthma for kids. The reason you can test that is in an area with gas stove next to electric stove apartments in a building, the kids in the electric stove area don't have asthma. The ones that in the gas stove ones do. The family members, the parents, don't have a history of it, and it's not genetic. Well, that's, they're cherry picking the cases where you could find out if it's causing a problem. Then they did the generalized population studies. It still came out the same way, where gas was available and used for cooking specifically. Okay, well, what about mandates for the water heater? Water heaters are mandated to be safer. And they're supposed to be sniffer tested, that piece of equipment for testing the air quality. Same thing with the one that heats up your air for warming your house. The gas furnace. They're supposed to vent externally. But your gas stove, for some reason, you're not realizing that you're in the direct path that you wouldn't tolerate in a wood stove. A wood stove with the pipe taken off and aimed at your face. So here's how you get around it. Put in the vent so you have the exhaust. It's an exhaust pipe. Open a window while cooking if you don't have one. Use your range vent if you have one, and if you don't, install one if you can. You can get cheap equivalents that will do good enough. They're not perfect, but it will reduce your risk. Harm reduction. Cook on back burners when you use them, towards the vent. That's it. Just use the back burners. In my case, how many burners are you actually using making something? I'm sorry, unless you're Julia Childs, most of you are not using more than 1 or 2 burners, so just use the 2 back ones. And in my case, when I found out how bad this was compared to my alcohol stove made out of Pepsi cans, I mean, seriously, I immediately went out and got a hot plate and made sure that the building owner and building manager knew that, no, you're going to have to acknowledge the law says I can do this, number 1. Number 2, it's not more of a threat, it's less. And next, I'm turning off my gas tube. I don't want a gas bill. I didn't use the oven at all, and I never cooked more than one thing at once. And I was able to cook everything when I'm camping on 1 burner. Why can't I do that at home? Well, it's more convenient. How many are you actually using? Unless you go out of your way, you're probably only using 2. So would 2 hot plates work? Maybe. Then people bring up, what if I want an electric range put in? I have to have a 200 amp hookup for the house. No, if you're only using 2, you're not needing that. Next, switch over to electric devices like a 1-burner induction stove that's a little more efficient, or tea kettles for heating up water, or rice cookers, or whatever. You don't have to go electric, but if you're going to go gas, you have to do it correctly. And yes, the natural gas industry, not the equipment industry for some reason, but the natural gas industry has tried really hard to maintain that no mandate should be put in for safety. They avoid any safety restrictions because they know that the majority of equipment that's sold would fail any practical test that would improve your air quality or even improve fire safety. The one they begrudgingly give up is fire safety. Do I think gas stoves should be outlawed? No, and they shouldn't be banned, but they shouldn't be shit quality anymore. That's about all I got to say. Next. Just treat it like you're camping and ventilate it correctly. Would you sit in your tent? Oh, so wait a minute, never mind. Some of you would actually do that. But treat it as being as dangerous as a cooking fire. And again, you wouldn't run a wood stove without, the stovepipe, right? Do you have a stovepipe for your gas stove? The other one is you can get ones that do a bypass where it heats up a panel, a plate, and it's actually even better than what you thought, and then vents it through the vent as hot gases. It heats up just as good. It just takes a little longer. It's a hot plate. It's like a wood stove. I prefer them. I got to use one once. It was fantastic. And it almost can't release any gases. And a lot of them come with catalytic converter devices stuck in the chimney to get rid of any dangerous gases anyway. Thanks for watching. Have a good day. Good luck.